The Australian economy is booming, or gloomy, depending on who you ask. If you ask any economist, they'll give you an answer based on stats, figures, and numbers. According to this, Australia's doing just fine, and there's nothing to worry about. Unemployment's down, and the economy is picking up. And Anthony Albanese's Future Made in Australia project is picking up steam. But then, if you were to ask the average Aussie, they'd tell you that they've nearly depleted their savings, and times couldn't be harder. The economy is worse than ever. Prices are high, and it's hard to sustain yourself, even with full-time employment. But the numbers don't lie, and an entire nation's workforce can't lie either. So, who's telling the truth? Wouldn't you know it, they both are. As convoluted as that may seem, we have to take a look at the data, compare it with what the people are saying, and determine what comes next. This is the future of work in Australia, the trends as we see them, as the predictions that seem plausible. When Anthony Albanese was asked to quote the unemployment percentage in Australia during his run for the premiership in April 2011, he fumbled. What made the gaffe worse was the fact that this was day one of the federal election campaign, and the fact that Anthony's political rival, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, knew the exact figures. To make matters worse, Anthony had only just been talking about the plight of Australians when he was asked about the unemployment rate and cash rate. According to the leader of the Labour Party, it was 5.4 something. Katie Gallagher came to the rescue as the party's finance spokesperson and confirmed that the unemployment rate was actually 4% and the cash rate was 0.1%. Despite the massive misstep, Anthony was able to turn the gaffe into a virtuous moment, something that resonated with many Australians. He claimed that he would do better, and knowing the exact figures would be step one. His plea for citizens to give him another chance worked, and in May 2022, he assumed the office as the 31st Prime Minister of Australia. Naturally, we'd have to start this video with unemployment trends. To say that Australian trends in unemployment have been confusing would be putting it lightly. From 2018 to 2022, the percentage has only gone higher once. That would have been in 2020, as it soared to 6.46%. One of the highest figures ever recorded. The numbers would eventually come down in 2021 to 5.12%, and then go even lower in 2022 to 3.7%. What happened in 2020? COVID-19 was when the world effectively shut down and many people lost their jobs, if not worse. The pandemic affected economic trends all around the world, with Australia mitigating the turmoil with relief systems and policies to help the newly unemployed cope with the change. It worked well enough that Australia was lauded as being one of only a handful of countries that held its own during the pandemic. Naturally, this was something that was reflected in numbers when the lockdown ban was lifted. But remember what we said about confusing? The Australian economy isn't in decline and unemployment is going down. However, to suggest that the average person isn't struggling would be inaccurate. They're struggling very much, and this is despite them becoming full-time employees. A huge chunk of the Labour Party's campaign was dedicated to the Future Made in Australia program. That is, a social and economic reform introduced under Anthony Albanese that would see to it that Australia becomes wholly self-sufficient. While many have called this program overly ambitious, Anthony believes that it can be done. It might take some time, till 2050 to be specific, but eventually Australia will be entirely self-reliant. Understandably, this meant depending on its workforce. But how has that fared? Now, Australia is home to the famous, sometimes infamous, points-based immigration system. A system that's been popularized all over the world as the Australian immigration system. Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was a keen advocate of the system when introducing it to Great Britain. The often controversial immigration system has had its fair bit of challenges, even though it was designed to limit migration. The gist of the system was to ascribe points to anyone wanting to enter the country. If Australia needed what the immigrant was offering, they'd let him in. This way, only skilled workers were allowed into Australia, save for asylum seekers. But that's a different category altogether. Like most nations, Australia had a growing reliance on skilled migrants coming in from various fields. To give you an example, the hospitality industry was overly reliant on migrants. Part of the Future Made in Australia program was to limit this dependency, not just in the hospitality industry, but across every sector in the nation. Have they done that? Yes, in a way they have. In May 2024, the unemployment rate fell by 0.1%. It used to be 4.1% in April 2024, and it was down to 4% in May. In terms of how many jobs were created during this time, a rough estimate would suggest somewhere near 42,000. And we're talking about full-time employment opportunities. The way Australian Employment Minister Tony Burke sees it, this is a positive change and will be reflected in Australian economics at the end of 2024. But people aren't ready to cheer him on, at least not yet. To counter Burke's assessment, food bank organizers across the country have one of their own. 60% of those reliant on food bank services have at least one full-time employee in the household. It's true that by setting goals to minimize dependency on migrant workers, those who do it for cheap, the Australian job market has boomed. Unfortunately, it's also true that most people, including those newly full-time employees, are still struggling. That's because when one figure goes down, another goes up. Simply, rent prices are now unlikely to go down. According to Burke, giving unemployment opportunities back to the Australian public would mean that inflation would reach a near standstill. You wouldn't want it to go too far down, otherwise the nation would be in an active recession. But what about vibecession? Yes, that's the term the Australian public has come up with to express how Australia might not be in an active recession just yet, but the vibe sure says otherwise. While vibecession might sound like a pop culture term, and nothing to take seriously, it's a term that caught on several parts of the world, particularly in the United States, where it originated. While the term might seem gimmicky to some, its sentiment is serious. People are struggling. The question is, what's the Australian government going to do about it? 360 delegates sat on a panel for the Australian Financial Review Workforce Summit in February of 2023. They discussed a multitude of things. How has Australia been faring in the years since the global pandemic? What do these trends mean for the next decade? How have natural disasters halted any economic progress? Will geopolitical instability negatively affect the economy? Simply, what does the future of work in Australia look like? A key point of conversation that came up was Australia's rapidly rising aging population. To sustain the growing number of retirees, the country needed a greater number of people working to maintain productivity. Comparing this stat with the number of jobs available, now more so because the growing number of dependents, Australia needed a third more doctors in the healthcare sector. The technology sector, Australia's booming sector, was also brought up. Yes, there are jobs available in the sector, more by the minute, but there aren't that many people in the country skilled enough to take over. Will the Labour Party have to relax its immigration policies to allow skilled technical workers in? It seems so. Tech jobs rose by triple the rate of the rest of the economy in 2023. This was even though the number of tech-capable people in Australia couldn't keep up with the demand. Skilled labor was needed from elsewhere, something Anthony Albanese's government hadn't accounted for. But now they have. This led the summit to reflect on a possible change in national priorities as the years went on, concentrating on technology education. Technology has crept its way into every Aussie's everyday life and every sector in the country. The Tech Council of Australia's report on Australia as a regional tech hub noted that the sector already generates 8.5% of Australia's GDP, with 20 of the world's tech unicorns, and has strengths across SaaS, fintech, biotech, medtech, mining, education, and energy. The Labour Party's Future Made in Australia program has been challenged by many, including some people in Albanese's own cabinet. The Productivity Commissioner, Danielle Woods, has commented on how the program is overambitious and that Australia doesn't have to compete with leading countries, unlike what the Prime Minister has suggested. To jog your memory here, when faced with criticism and backlash over how the Future Made in Australia's renewable energy goals would raise taxes, the Prime Minister referenced several other nations that were working on achieving the same goals. According to Woods, it was an unfair comparison. Likewise, while the project hasn't been dismissed entirely by Woods and many others in Australia, some points have been challenged, and immigration would be one of them. While the topic remains contentious, delegates at the summit believed that Australia needed immigrant workers, but maybe a compromise with Anthony's Future Made in Australia project could be reached. Simply, doctors and tech workers fill the roles that are necessary. In addition, jobs in hospitality and low-wage jobs where migrants are offered lower salaries. While this might not be a fun fact, it's one nonetheless. Per the Minister for Home Affairs, the Honourable Claire O'Neill MP, migration is Australia's special sauce. Research confirms that over 75% of global executives think at least half their skill gaps will be filled by their own people. Mentoring an existing workforce and encouraging people to pursue lateral career paths is as legitimate an option as building a new one. The push for gender equity in the workforce remains tied to gender equity at home and throughout society. As more men adopt flexible work options or roles that are inherently more flexible, more women will be able to pursue their careers on an equal footing. As more women find careers in high-growth, high-wage industries like tech, wage equity will improve. Shared parental leave is critical, as shifting the dynamic for home care at an early age carries through as a family norm. Underrepresented groups in the workforce also include First Nations Australians, regional youth, and older people. The panel noted that First Nations employment continues to be held back by a lack of pre- and early career education. Even though there are long-standing government and corporate quotas for Indigenous suppliers, they're hard to fill. Corporates and policies must continue their roles in nurturing the capabilities of emerging First Nations leaders, ensuring that they get senior experience and opportunities so that they can build businesses from within or independently. Diversity matters. Companies whose leadership teams have a high percentage of women and culturally diverse backgrounds are significantly more likely to have above-average profitability. What the everyday Australian is perhaps most interested in is unemployment. Specifically, what can the country do to reduce the rate of unemployment? The summit noted that it might be a jarring task, but it's an achievable one, especially if a multifaceted approach is taken. Key strategies including investing in education and skills training, fostering innovation and entrepreneurship, enhancing labor market flexibility, implementing targeted government policies, addressing socioeconomic inequalities, and promoting collaboration between key stakeholders. Startups and small businesses create jobs, particularly in sectors like technology and renewable energy. Government policies that offer financial incentives, reduce regulatory burdens, and provide support for entrepreneurs can stimulate business creation and expansion. Enhancing labor market flexibility through remote work and gig economy opportunities can integrate underrepresented groups into the workforce. The pandemic proved the viability of remote work, benefiting people with disabilities, parents with young children, and those in regional areas. So what does the future of work in Australia look like to you?